Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here. Tell me, is there snow where you are tonight, or merely the stillness that cold weather leaves behind? There is something in a sealed, quiet house that sharpens the mind wonderfully. The way lamplight falls on paper, the way ink sits on a page, the way a single altered detail can unravel everything a careful person believed to be settled. Watson understood this. Do subscribe so no margin goes unread. Now draw close, for objects do not invent. They merely remain where guilt has left them. You'll find Watson's Margins on Spotify too. The link is just below. At Blackthorn Hall. There are evenings in London, particularly in the deep heart of winter, when the city seems to draw its breath and hold it. The yellow fog, that faithful companion of our Baker Street existence, had that night been displaced by something altogether more severe. Word had come in from the northern counties of a storm of uncommon violence, and even in our sitting room the windows shuddered periodically in their frames, as though the weather wished to remind us that it was not yet done with England. I sat with a medical journal open upon my knee, though I confess I had read the same paragraph 3 times without comprehension. Holmes occupied his customary chair, a cold pipe between his teeth, and his grey eyes fixed upon the ceiling with that expression of remote abstraction that I had come to recognise as either profound thought or deliberate idleness, though I could rarely determine which. "You're not reading, Watson," he said, without altering his gaze by a fraction. "I am reading perfectly well," I replied, with more conviction than I felt. "You have not turned a page in 22 minutes, and your right foot has been tapping an irregular rhythm against the fender for the last 5. It is not impatience, because you have nowhere to go. It is the weather. You find it oppressive." I set the journal down and acknowledged that he was correct, as he so irritatingly often was. The storm had been building since early afternoon, and by 8:30 in the evening the streets below Baker Street were largely deserted, the gas lamps struggling to illuminate a world that seemed to have contracted to a narrow radius of cold and wind. Mrs. Hudson had been in once to replenish the coal, and had reported with some satisfaction that the pavements were already treacherous. It was in this atmosphere of enforced domestic quiet that we heard the bell below, followed shortly by the particular tread of a person unused to our stairs. Mrs. Hudson appeared in the doorway with an expression of mild surprise, for callers at that hour in such weather are uncommon even by Baker Street's irregular standards. "A boy, Mr. Holmes, with a letter. He says he was engaged at Victoria Station by a lady who had just arrived by the Northern Express." Holmes extended his hand without sitting upright, and Mrs. Hudson passed him the envelope. He held it to the lamp, examining the paper, the seal, and the handwriting before he opened it. I waited. He read the contents twice, then set the letter upon his knee and regarded me with something that was not quite a smile. "We're invited to the countryside, Watson, though I suspect the word invited does insufficient credit to the urgency. The letter was from a Lady Evelyn Harcourt, writing from Blackthorn Hall, a manor house situated some miles beyond the town of Harrowfield on the northern moors. She wrote in a hand that was clear, controlled, and betrayed very little of whatever emotion had prompted the writing. Her husband, Sir Geoffrey Harcourt, a retired magistrate of considerable standing, had died 3 days earlier. The household physician had attended and had certified the death as arising from failure of the heart. The matter had seemed, to all appearances, complete. Yet Lady Evelyn was not a woman satisfied by appearances. She had examined the death certificate in preparation for correspondence with the family solicitor, and she'd noticed something that, once seen, could not be unseen. The time of death recorded on the document had been altered. What had originally read as 11:50 in the evening had been clumsily amended, she believed, to 12:20 after midnight. The alteration was not clean. It bore the marks of a pen pressed firmly over prior ink, and the surrounding letters showed a subtle inconsistency of colour that the original had not possessed. This in itself might have been attributed to simple error on the physician's part, and she said as much. but Lady Evelyn Harcourt was also a woman who understood the law, as one must when one has spent 30 years in proximity to a magistrate. The precise time of her husband's death was not a bureaucratic detail. It was the determining fact in a legal matter of considerable consequence. Sir Geoffrey had, in the weeks before his death, revised the terms of his estate by means of a codicil, executed in the presence of his solicitor. By the terms of this codicil, which took effect at the stroke of midnight, the estate of Blackthorn Hall would pass not to his nephew and heir presumptive, Mr. Edward Harcourt, but would instead be held in trust for Miss Clara Bellamy, Sir Geoffrey's ward, a young woman who had lived under his care since early childhood. If Sir Geoffrey had died before midnight, the original succession stood. If after midnight, Miss Bellamy received the estate. The difference of 30 minutes, therefore, was the difference between two entirely distinct inheritances. Holmes folded the letter and placed it upon the mantelpiece. "There are 6 guests remaining in the house," he said, more to himself than to me. "The snow has made the roads impassable. Lady Evelyn tells us that no one has departed since the death, and that no one from outside could have reached the hall." "Then whoever altered the certificate is still within the house," I said. "Or the alteration was innocent, Watson. Dr. Fell, the local physician, may have made an error and corrected it in perfectly good faith. That is the most natural explanation and the one most people will accept. But you do not accept it." He turned from the mantelpiece, and in the lamplight his expression had taken on that keen, focused quality that I associated with problems that genuinely interested him. "I accept nothing at present. But a man who makes a clerical correction does so neatly, and in the ordinary course of the same sitting. He does not press a different pen over a dried inscription, nor does he neglect to initial the amendment, as is standard medical practice. Lady Harcourt does not say whether the amendment was initialed, but her language suggests it was not." He went to his desk and drew out a railway timetable. I observed with some resignation that my evening's reading was concluded. "Is there a train?" I asked. "The first northbound express leaves at 5:30 in the morning. If the line is open, we shall be at Harrowfield by noon." He tossed the timetable aside. "You will wish to pack, Watson. The moors in winter are not kind to men who have left their warmest coats in London. Holmes, the storm has been worse before, and the railway's more reliable than the road." He sat again, drew a fresh pipe from the rack, and reached for his tobacco. "A man may die naturally, Watson, yet leave behind him a most unnatural document." I retired to pack my travelling bag, though I confess a measure of unease accompanied me up the stairs. It was not the cold I feared, nor even the isolation that Lady Evelyn's letter described. It was the quality of stillness that her words had conveyed. That particular stillness of a house sealed from the world by snow, in which the inhabitants must go on regarding one another across dinner tables and drawing rooms, whilst one among them, perhaps, held knowledge that none of the others possessed. I had accompanied Holmes to dark places before, and had found them less troubling than the comfortable rooms in which civilized people concealed uncomfortable things. By the time I had assembled what I needed, the fire in the sitting room had burned low. Holmes was still in his chair, the pipe unlit, his eyes upon the ceiling. He had not moved, but I knew from long experience that whatever internal machinery drove his remarkable intelligence was at that moment fully engaged. I said good night. He did not reply. Chapter 2. The respectable prisoners of the manor. The Northern Express was late by 40 minutes, and the journey itself was a thing of grey endurance rather than pleasure. Holmes sat opposite me in the compartment with a rug across his knees and a sheaf of papers in his lap, though whether he read them or merely used them as a prop for thought I could not determine. The countryside beyond the windows grew steadily bleaker as we pressed northward, the gentle undulations of the home counties giving way to a harder, older landscape. By mid-morning the fields were white, and the hedgerows had taken on that particular frozen stillness that suggests a world holding its breath against the cold. We were met at Harrowfield by a man named Joskins, the Blackthorn Hall coachman, who had driven out through the freshly opened road with a look of grim determination and a horse that clearly shared his mood. The distance from the station to the hall was not great in terms of miles, but the road climbed steadily across open ground where the wind had piled the snow into ridges that caught the wheel rims and required Joskins to coax the animal forward with murmured reassurances. Holmes sat very upright beside me and watched the landscape with an attention that suggested he was committing it to some internal register. Blackthorn Hall announced itself first as a darkened mass against the white hillside, then resolved into a long, low-fronted manor house of grey stone, its central section perhaps 2 centuries old, and its wings added at intervals thereafter, as each generation found the existing rooms insufficient. The effect was of a building that had grown without design and settled into its grounds through sheer persistence. The snow lay undisturbed across the forecourt and along the avenue of bare limes that led to the entrance, and it was this undisturbed quality that struck me most forcibly as we descended from the coach. The world had sealed itself round the house, and the house had accepted the condition. Lady Evelyn Harcourt received us in the entrance hall with composure that I thought cost her some effort to maintain. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 50, with pale eyes and the kind of stillness in her bearing that one sometimes sees in people who have long kept their own counsel. She thanked Holmes for making the journey, expressed a brief and entirely genuine regret about the conditions of it, and led us through to a sitting room where a fire had been made up against the cold. The household was gathered, as she had written, and she introduced each in turn with the measured precision of a woman who had hosted many people and forgotten very few of them. Edward Harcourt came forward first. He was a man of perhaps 35, dark-haired and lean, with a quality of restlessness about him that expressed itself in small movements of the hands and an inability to hold any single expression for more than a few moments. He greeted Holmes with politeness that seemed genuine enough, though there was something beneath it, not hostility precisely, but a wariness, as of a man who suspects he's about to be found out in something he has not yet done. Miss Clara Bellamy sat apart from the others near the window, a young woman of perhaps 23 or 24, dark-eyed and composed in a manner that seemed natural rather than assumed. She rose to acknowledge us, murmured something appropriate and returned to her chair. I noticed that she held a small book in her hands, but had not, I thought, been reading it. Dr. Ambrose Fell was a stout, pink-faced man of middle age, with the genial manner and careful eyes of a country physician who has learned that his patients appreciate reassurance above almost everything. He shook Holmes's hand with visible vigour and declared the circumstances most distressing indeed, in a way that suggested he had said these words several times already, and found them no less true for the repetition. Reverend Miles Pritchard was a slight, soft-spoken clergyman of about 60, with silver hair and a habit of pressing his fingertips together when he listened, which gave him the appearance of a man in continuous silent prayer. He regarded Holmes with mild interest, and Watson, I suspected, with the slightly greater warmth he reserved for those in practical professions. Mr. Silas Trent, the family solicitor, was a spare, careful man whose clothes were very good, and whose expression suggested he had spent much of his professional life listening to things that were none of his business, and was not entirely comfortable with having done so. He acknowledged our arrival with a brief inclination of the head, and returned almost immediately to a position near the mantelpiece, where he stood as a man might stand who wishes to depart but recognises that the moment has not yet come. Captain Rotherby completed the group. He rose easily from his chair and came forward with the unhurried assurance of a man accustomed to making himself agreeable in company. He was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered and brown-faced, with the kind of even courtesy that sits naturally on men who have spent years managing others. He said he was glad Holmes had come, and his gladness had an effortless quality that made it thoroughly convincing. Holmes thanked Lady Evelyn and asked whether we might see the death certificate before anything else was discussed. She produced it without comment, and he carried it to the window, where the cold northern light was clearest. I watched his face rather than the document, which I had learned long ago was the more informative subject of study. He held the paper at different angles, tilted it once against the light, and examined the lower section with a small lens that he had taken from his waistcoat pocket without drawing attention to the act. The examination lasted perhaps 3 minutes. No one in the room spoke, which I thought remarkable, given that several of them had presumably very particular feelings about what that document contained. Holmes returned the certificate to Lady Evelyn. "Who first noticed the alteration?" he asked. "I did," she said, "on the morning following the signing, when I was preparing correspondence for Mr. Trent. The ink at the time of death differed in shade from the rest, and the figures themselves, if you look closely, have been written over something that was already dry. And Dr. Fell was not consulted before you wrote to me." Fell cleared his throat. "I was informed of Lady Evelyn's concern," he said carefully. "I told her, as I tell you now, that I was confused that night. The clocks in the house are not all in agreement, and in the agitation of the moment I may well have first recorded the wrong time and corrected it afterward. I assure you there was no intention to deceive." "No one has suggested intention," Holmes said pleasantly. He turned to the room with the air of a man who has heard everything he required and wishes now only to be left in peace to consider it. He asked whether he and I might be shown to our rooms, and whether it would be possible to examine Sir Geoffrey's bedchamber before the light failed. As we were led upstairs by a silent housemaid, I fell into step beside Holmes and murmured that the household seemed, on the surface, entirely cooperative. "Entirely," he agreed, in a tone that assigned the word approximately the value of nothing at all. "And the certificate." He was quiet for a moment, his hand trailing along the banister. "The certificate was altered, Watson. Of that there is no question. The pen used was finer than Fell's, the pressure heavier, and the ink, though someone has attempted to match it, is a fraction lighter in saturation than the original. It was done after the document had dried, some hours after, I would estimate. Then Fell did not make the correction himself. Almost certainly not. Which means that someone in this house," he said, pausing at the top of the stair and dropping his voice to a little above a murmur, "was alone with a signed medical certificate long enough to alter it without interference. That is a fact of considerable interest. It does not yet tell us who or why. But it tells us that we are not, as the police have assumed, looking at a clerical error." He followed the housemaid toward our rooms, and I came after him, conscious of the quietness of the corridor and the weight of snow pressing against the long window at the end of it, and the 7 people we had left below in the sitting room, each of them composing themselves for what was to come. Chapter 3. The Locked Room and the Simple Explanation. Sir Geoffrey Harcourt's bedchamber was at the end of the east corridor, separated from the nearest guest room by a linen cupboard and a short turn in the passage that gave it a degree of natural privacy. The housemaid unlocked it for us without comment, handed Holmes the key, and withdrew with the quiet efficiency of a servant who has learned that the fewer questions she answers voluntarily, the fewer she will be asked. The room was cold. No fire had been laid since the death, and the window, though shut fast, admitted a thin draught through its aged frame that moved the curtains very slightly and made the temperature of the space several degrees below that of the corridor. Holmes stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, which was his habit. He preferred to look before he moved, as a man might study the surface of a frozen pond before committing his weight to it. I entered behind him and took stock of what was before us. The bed occupied the centre of the far wall, its counterpane still disturbed from the night of the death, folded back on one side as Dr. Fell had presumably left it. A small table stood to the left of the bed, bearing a candlestick in which the remnant of a candle had burned to within an inch of the socket, the wax pooled and set in a smooth disc around its base. On the mantelpiece stood a bracket clock of the sort one sees in country houses, a solid, reliable instrument in a mahogany case, its hands arrested at 20 minutes past 12. A wing-backed chair sat near the window, a book open and face down upon its arm. The rug before the fireplace was of a deep turkey pattern, and it had been displaced, not dramatically, but sufficiently that one corner lay folded under at an angle inconsistent with natural wear. Holmes crossed to the window first. He examined the latch, pressed it once, and observed the snow on the outer sill, which lay uniformly smooth and unbroken, as it had lain since the storm began. He moved without comment to the door, crouched, and studied the lock from both sides. I watched him without speaking. There are occasions when Holmes's silences are more instructive than other men's explanations, and this was one of them. "The door was locked from within," I offered, recalling what Lady Evelyn had written. "So we have been told." He straightened and looked at the keyhole with the lens. The key was in the lock on the interior side when Dr. Fell arrived. The lock is of the older mortise variety, and the key is a substantial one. It could not have been turned from the corridor by any mechanical means. The tolerances are too tight for thread or wire. Then no one entered or left after Sir Geoffrey retired. Holmes looked at me with that expression of patient amusement that I had long since ceased to find entirely flattering. That is one conclusion. Another is that Sir Geoffrey locked his door at some point before his death, and that whatever occurred subsequently occurred within these walls. The two statements are not identical, Watson, though they resemble each other at a distance. He went to the mantel clock next. He did not touch it immediately, but examined it from several angles, bending close to study the base and the surface beneath it. Then he lifted it carefully, turned it in his hands, and set it down again in precisely the same position. "What do you make of the clock?" I asked. Presently, he moved to the candle. The candlestick was of plain brass, serviceable rather than decorative. Holmes tilted it toward the light from the window and studied the pooled wax, the way it had run and settled, and the marks it had left on the table's surface. He was very still for perhaps half a minute. Then he set it down and went to examine the displaced rug. He knelt and straightened the corner with one finger, observing the indentation in the pile beneath. He pressed the pile in several places, comparing what he found, and arose with a slight tightening of expression that I had come to associate not with conclusion, but with the confirmation of a preliminary suspicion. I had been examining the room myself in the interim with rather less method but genuine attention. "The police theory," I said, "seems straightforward enough. Sir Geoffrey retired with a candle. He died in the night from his heart. Dr. Fell was called, examined him, recorded the time, and made an error. The clock stopped when it ran down." "You have rendered the simple explanation very faithfully," Holmes said. "Now allow me to render it less simply." He moved to the centre of the room and stood with his hands clasped behind him, addressing the space rather than me, which was also a familiar habit. "The clock has not run down. A clock of this quality and a mechanism properly wound will run for 8 days. The key is in the winding arbor and was turned recently. The spring has tension remaining. The hands were moved to 12:20 and the mechanism arrested deliberately. Someone pushed the minute hand forward against the escapement until it jammed." I looked at the clock. I could see nothing to contradict him, and nothing, had I examined it alone, that would have led me to that conclusion. "The clock was stopped by hand," I said, "and placed here after the fact, I suspect, though I shall need to verify something before I say so with confidence." He turned to the candle. "The wax has pooled to the left of the wick and run down the left side of the shaft. The candlestick is positioned on the right side of the table. For the wax to behave as it has, the candle must have burned at a leftward tilt, which is impossible in this position unless the table itself is uneven, which it is not, or unless the candle was burning elsewhere and was carried here afterward, almost certainly in someone's hand, which would account precisely for the drip pattern." I considered this. The candle was brought from another room and placed here to suggest Sir Geoffrey had been reading or sitting up before he died, to suggest he had been alive and active at a time when perhaps he was not. Holmes went to the rug, and the rug has been displaced toward the bed, not away from it. If a man rises in the night and moves toward the window or the door, he disturbs the rug in that direction. This fold runs the other way. Something was moved across this rug toward the bed, not from it. The cold of the room had begun to assert itself, and I was grateful for my overcoat. Outside, the snow had resumed, falling steadily past the window in large, deliberate flakes that accumulated in silence on the untouched sill. "He did not die naturally," I said. Holmes turned from the rug. "I did not say that. I said that the scene presented to us was constructed, or at the very least adjusted after the fact. Whether Sir Geoffrey's heart failed of its own accord, or was assisted toward failure, the physical evidence in this room does not yet tell us. The certificate was altered, the clock was moved and stopped, the candle was carried here, the rug was disturbed by something being brought toward the bed rather than away from it." He walked once more around the perimeter of the room, slowly, his gaze moving along the skirting and the walls and the ceiling. "Too much snow outside," he said, almost to himself, "and too much neatness within. Someone has worked very carefully in here, Watson, and careful work always leaves traces, not of what was done, but of how much thought was required to conceal it." He pocketed his lens and moved toward the door, and I followed him into the corridor, where the warmth was comparative rather than genuine, and the light already failing as the afternoon compressed itself toward an early northern dusk. "What do we do next?" I asked. "We go down to dinner," he said, "and we listen. Conversation at table in a house under strain is frequently more instructive than conversation in an interview. People conceal things deliberately in formal exchange. They reveal them accidentally over soup." And with that he set off along the corridor, leaving me to close the door on the cold room and the stopped clock and the candle that had burned the wrong way, and to follow him toward whatever the evening would disclose. Chapter 4. Red Herrings in the Snow. Dinner at Blackthorn Hall was a formal affair conducted under the pressure of circumstances that made formality simultaneously more necessary and more difficult. Lady Evelyn presided at the head of the table with the composed authority of a woman who understands that the maintenance of ordinary ritual is itself a kind of courage. The soup was consumed with general expressions of appreciation that nobody quite meant. The fish course was debated on neutral ground, and the conversation moved along those careful channels that people in uncomfortable proximity will excavate when they dare not address what truly concerns them. Holmes ate with moderate attention and spoke very little. He had positioned himself, by some arrangement I did not observe him making, between Captain Rotherby and Miss Bellamy, which placed him at the advantageous midpoint of the table's longer reach. I sat opposite, beside Dr. Fell, whose conversation ran warmly on local matters, the road conditions, a difficult confinement he had attended the previous week, the uncertain prospects for the spring, and who avoided with considerable skill any reference to the death certificate or to the investigation that had brought us north. It was not until the cloth was partially cleared and the decanter had made one circuit of the table that Edward Harcourt, who had been drinking with more consistency than his neighbours, introduced what everyone had been carefully not saying. "I suppose," he said, directing his remarks at no one in particular, "that Mr. Holmes will wish to question us all formally. I should prefer to get it done." "You are already being questioned," Holmes said pleasantly, without looking up from his glass, "though I should not let it trouble you." There was a brief silence of the kind that follows a remark that is either very stupid or very perceptive. Harcourt appeared unsure which it was and covered his uncertainty by refilling his glass. It was after dinner, when the company had divided along the customary lines, the women to the drawing-room, the men to port, and an atmosphere of mutual suspicion, that Holmes excused himself early and drew me into the corridor with a touch on the elbow that I had learned to interpret as immediate and non-negotiable. "Harcourt's glove," he said, once we were beyond earshot. "Did you observe it?" I had not. I said so. Left-hand glove, dropped beside the fender of the study fireplace. It was retrieved by the housemaid during dinner and placed on the hall table, where it now sits. It is a good glove, dusk-in, well kept, and it has dried boot-black on the thumb that does not belong to a man's ordinary evening. Harcourt has not been to the study since our arrival. The glove was there before we came. Then he was in the study the night of Sir Geoffrey's death, or beforehand. But a servant, I am told, heard raised voices from the study on that evening, between Sir Geoffrey and a man whose voice she could not identify with certainty, but whose tone she described as urgent and unhappy. Holmes paused. Edward Harcourt argued with his uncle that night. About money, I would estimate, given the state of his cuffs and the brand of tobacco he now smokes, in place of what the cuffs suggest he formerly smoked. He has come down in his circumstances rather faster than his manner admits. We stood in the half-light of the corridor, and I turned this over. The logic was not difficult to follow. Harcourt's inheritance depended upon the earlier time of death. He had been in the study with Sir Geoffrey on the evening of the death. He had reason to want Sir Geoffrey dead before midnight. If the original time on the certificate, 11:50, was correct, then he stood to benefit enormously. Surely the police will see the same thing, I said. They already do, Holmes replied. Inspector Crail of the Harrowfield Constabulary is due tomorrow morning, assuming the road holds. He will find the glove, hear about the argument, note the inheritance question, and begin building a case around Edward Harcourt before he has removed his coat. And is he wrong to do so? Holmes turned and began walking toward the staircase. The altered certificate does not benefit Harcourt, Watson. If someone wished to protect Harcourt, they would have left the time at 11:50. The alteration moves the time to 12:20, after midnight, which gives the estate to Clara Bellamy and removes Harcourt from it entirely. If Harcourt altered the certificate to cover his own actions, he has done so in a direction that destroys his own case. That is either an error of extraordinary stupidity, or it is something else altogether. I had not considered this, and I said so. The logic was clear enough once stated, but it had the quality of Holmes's best observations. It was entirely obvious in retrospect and had been invisible to me beforehand. We went upstairs and Holmes retired to his room, not, I suspected, to sleep, but to sit in that particular manner of his that resembles sleep closely enough to deceive anyone who does not know him well. The following morning brought Inspector Crail, as predicted, a brisk, capable man who received Holmes with the wary cordiality that professional policemen generally extend to him, grateful for the assistance, uncertain about the terms on which it was being offered. He had spoken with Lady Evelyn, examined the certificate, and been shown the glove by the time Holmes and I descended to find him in the library. Suspicion had also, by the morning, found a second resting place. Clara Bellamy had been seen, by Reverend Pritchard, who had encountered her in the corridor, moving through the East Passage after midnight on the night of Sir Geoffrey's death. She had been dressed and carrying a small lamp. Pritchard had thought it an unusual hour for walking, and had noted it without raising it until the investigation gave it new significance. Holmes asked Clara about this directly, at mid-morning, in the small parlour off the entrance hall. She received the question without visible alarm, which I thought either very composed or very guilty, and for a moment I could not determine which. I had intended to speak to my guardian, she said. I knew about the codicil. Mr. Trent had informed me of its terms earlier that week at Sir Geoffrey's instruction. I am not certain what I wished. Perhaps to thank him, or to tell him that it was not necessary. He had always been generous. I did not want him to think I had expected it. But you did not speak to him, Holmes said. I reached the corridor and lost my courage. I stood at the end of it for perhaps 5 minutes, and then I went back to my room. It seemed an unjust hour to disturb an old man. Holmes nodded and said nothing further on the subject in her presence. But as we left the parlour and moved into the entrance hall, he paused briefly before a small mirror on the wall. Not, I thought, to look at himself, but to look at something reflected behind him, and then moved on. In the hall he stopped beside the coat stand and appeared to examine, without any particular emphasis, the cuff of Captain Rotherby's greatcoat which hung there with the other outdoor garments. He did not touch it. He looked at it for perhaps 3 seconds, and then walked past. That afternoon, while Holmes closeted himself in the library with the household accounts at Lady Evelyn's provision, I walked the ground floor corridors and found myself thinking about what the investigation had produced so far. 2 suspects with visible motive, both capable of explaining their suspicious behaviour in terms that were entirely plausible. A certificate altered in a direction that served neither of the 2 most obvious candidates. a room staged with deliberate care by someone who had thought carefully about what they were doing. Holmes had said that motive was not movement. I was beginning to understand what he meant by that. The people in this house who had the most reason to act were not necessarily the people who had acted, and the person who had acted had taken considerable trouble to ensure that all the visible reasons pointed elsewhere. I met Captain Rotherby in the entrance hall as the light was failing. He was affable, helpful, and expressed great confidence that Holmes would resolve the matter satisfactorily. He had a particular way of speaking about the other members of the household that was not unkind but was faintly organising, as though he were, with the greatest goodwill imaginable, arranging the pieces of a composition that only he could fully see. I mentioned this to Holmes over supper. He considered it for a moment, then said, "Yes, I had noticed," and returned to his meal without elaboration. Chapter 5. What is seen rather than said. The second full day at Blackthorn Hall began with a frost so sharp that the inner surfaces of the windows had acquired a delicate lacework of ice, and the world outside had contracted to a uniform whiteness, broken only by the black verticals of the lime trees along the avenue. Inspector Crail had remained overnight, accommodated in the village inn at Harrowfield, but returning early by the road, which had been passable since yesterday noon, though by no means comfortable. He brought with him a constable, and an expression of determined official optimism that Holmes observed without comment. Holmes had already breakfasted when I came down, and had arranged with Lady Evelyn to speak with each member of the household separately during the course of the morning. This he conducted in the library, a long room lined with dark volumes that smelled of old leather and inadequate heating, where a single lamp on the desk supplemented the thin winter light from the window. I sat to one side throughout these interviews and took such notes as seemed useful. Holmes sat behind the desk with a stillness that was not relaxation, but concentration of a particular focused kind. Dr. Fell came first, as the person most directly implicated by the certificate. He settled himself in the chair across from Holmes with the manner of a man who has resolved to be helpful, and is anxious that his helpfulness should be properly appreciated. His account of the night of Sir Geoffrey's death was detailed, steady, and essentially unchanged from what he had offered at dinner and before. He had been called at approximately 1:45 by a housemaid, who reported that Sir Geoffrey had not answered his bell. He had come promptly, found the door locked, had it opened by means of the spare key kept in the butler's pantry, and had found Sir Geoffrey in bed, unresponsive. He had made his examination, determined that death had occurred, and written the certificate at the bedside table by lamplight, with considerable agitation of spirit since Sir Geoffrey had been his patient for 11 years. Holmes listened to all of this without interrupting. When Fell had finished, Holmes asked only one question. "When you wrote the certificate, did you look at the clock on the mantelpiece to determine the time of death?" Fell hesitated. It was a brief hesitation, a single beat where there ought to have been none. And then he said yes, he had looked at the clock. Holmes thanked him and let him go. I observed, after the door had closed, that Fell had not once looked directly at the certificate during the interview, though Holmes had placed it on the desk where it was plainly visible throughout. Holmes received this observation with a slight inclination of the head, and said that he had noticed the same thing. Captain Rotherby came next. He settled into the chair with the ease of a man for whom the furniture of drawing-rooms and libraries had never posed any difficulty, and he spoke with the pleasant, orderly fluency of someone who has given accounts of himself many times in many contexts, and found the exercise straightforward. He had spent the evening of Sir Geoffrey's death in the drawing-room until shortly after 11, when he had retired. He had heard nothing during the night, had been woken by the general stir of the household when the body was discovered, and had been of what assistance he could to Lady Evelyn in the difficult hours that followed. Holmes asked him about the household routine with some thoroughness. Who retired first, whether the servants locked the ground-floor rooms at a fixed hour, whether the corridor lamps were left burning or extinguished, and Rotherby answered each question without apparent difficulty, and with an accuracy that Lady Evelyn subsequently confirmed. He was knowledgeable about the house in a manner consistent with a frequent and welcome guest. Holmes thanked him. As Rotherby rose to leave, Holmes said, as though the thought had just occurred to him, "You were in the army, Captain. Which regiment?" "The Northumberland Fusiliers," Rotherby said, without any alteration of expression, "though it is some years since I sold my commission." "Indeed. And you were stationed abroad for a period?" "Several years in India, and a brief posting to the Cape." He smiled pleasantly. "Ancient history, Mr. Holmes." "Quite so," Holmes agreed, and let him go. Mr. Trent was precise, uncomfortable, and entirely cooperative in the manner of a man who understands that cooperation is his surest protection. He confirmed the terms of the codicil, the date of its execution, the identity of the witnesses, and the legal consequence of the time of death. He was visibly disturbed by the altered certificate, more so, I thought, than any other person in the house, and not because he had any personal stake in either outcome. He was disturbed because he had built a professional life on the reliability of documents, and the idea that a document could be tampered with after the fact struck him as a species of violation. Holmes asked him whether Sir Geoffrey had seemed apprehensive in the weeks before his death. Trent considered this carefully, in the manner of a man accustomed to weighing words. "He was preoccupied," he said at last. "He spoke to me once about an old matter, something from before his time on the bench, from his earlier life. He did not go into particulars, but he indicated that he had come into possession of information about a person of his acquaintance that he found deeply troubling, and that he felt a moral obligation to act upon it." "Did he name the person?" "He did not. He said only that the matter involved a breach of trust, and that the consequences, if it had proceeded as he suspected, had been borne by people who deserved better." After Trent, Reverend Pritchard settled into the chair with his customary air of attentive humility. He spoke softly and precisely, pressing his fingertips together when he thought, and releasing them when he answered, as though the physical gesture completed some internal mechanism of consideration. He confirmed his encounter with Clara Bellamy in the corridor and added, unprompted, that he had not mentioned it immediately because he had not wished to cause her distress, when distress was already abundant in the household. He was sorry if the delay had complicated matters. Holmes asked whether Sir Geoffrey had spoken to him in a pastoral capacity about anything that had been troubling him. Pritchard was quiet for a moment. "He came to me 3 Sundays ago," he said, "after the morning service. He asked me in general terms about the moral weight of old sins, whether a man who had benefited from a wrong committed in his youth remained guilty if he had not himself committed the wrong but had known of it and remained silent. I gave him the answer I believed to be correct, which is that the conscience is not easily absolved by the passage of time." He paused. He seemed relieved by this, oddly enough, as though knowing the weight of the thing made it easier to carry to its proper resolution. Holmes thanked him, and Pritchard departed with the quiet tread of a man who moves carefully through all rooms, including his own thoughts. Clara Bellamy came last. She sat without fidgeting, her hands folded in her lap, and met Holmes's attention with a directness that I found sympathetic. Holmes did not take her over the ground already covered in the parlour. Instead, he asked her about her guardian's manner toward her in recent weeks, whether he had been affectionate, distracted, agitated. "He was kind," she said. "He was always kind. But in the last month he seemed to be settling something in his mind. He told me once, when I brought him his evening tea, that a man who has carried a wrong long enough begins to mistake it for the natural weight of things. He said he did not intend to make that mistake any longer." Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, "And Captain Rotherby, how long has he been a visitor to this house?" Clara considered. 4 or 5 years, since before I came of age. He and Sir Geoffrey had some acquaintance from before my time here, though I never knew the precise connection. They seemed comfortable with each other, though not entirely easy. Not the ease of men who have always been friends." Holmes thanked her and sat for a long time after the room had emptied, his chin resting on his steepled fingers, his gaze fixed on the middle distance beyond the window's cold pane. "The question," he said at last, not turning from the window, "is not who profited, Watson. The question is, who could move unseen when all claimed to be still? I waited, but he did not go on. He had, I recognised, reached a point where thought was more useful than speech, and I had learned over many years not to interrupt that particular silence. Outside, the snow continued its patient, indifferent work. Chapter 6. The Silent Agreement. That afternoon, Holmes did something I had not expected. He put on his coat and boots and went outside. This was not in itself remarkable. Holmes was not a man who confined his investigations to the indoors, and the grounds of Blackthorn Hall offered material that no amount of library interviews could supply. What was unexpected was the direction he chose. He did not go toward the formal gardens or the lane that connected the hall to the village road, but rather toward the older part of the building, following the line of the east wing as it joined the original central section, and then disappearing around the corner into a part of the property I had not yet examined. I watched him from the library window for a moment, then retrieved my own coat and followed. The junction of the east and central wings formed a covered courtyard of the kind that occurs in older country houses, when different periods of construction meet without quite resolving their differences. It was not an elegant space. A stone-flagged passage opened to the sky at its centre but roofed on 3 sides, used by the evidence of stacked wood and a forgotten wheelbarrow, primarily as a service thoroughfare. The snow had come in at the open end and lay in an irregular pattern across the flags, deeper at the edges where it had drifted against the walls, shallower in the centre where the overhanging roof had provided some protection. Holmes was crouched near the interior door that led from the courtyard into the old wing of the house. He was examining the stone threshold with his lens. He did not look up when I approached, though he was certainly aware of me. "There," he said after a moment and pointed. I crouched beside him. The threshold was of a darker stone than the courtyard flags, and it retained moisture in its grain more visibly. On its surface, partially dried but still distinct, was a mark where something wet had been tracked inward. Not a boot print precisely, but a smear of the kind that results when a person steps from snow into a dry interior, and the melted snow transfers from the sole. It was not large. It might easily have been overlooked, and in any other context would have been. "Someone came through here," I said, "and went back the same way, I think. 1 ingress, 1 egress. The mark is single and directional." He stood and examined the door frame. "This door leads, as I confirmed with Lady Evelyn this morning, to the old chapel passage, a corridor that runs along the interior of the original wing, and connects, at its far end, to the east corridor where Sir Geoffrey's room is situated. It is not generally used. The family chapel fell out of regular use some 20 years ago, and the passage has been largely forgotten by the present household." "Forgotten by most of the household," I said. Holmes gave me a brief look that indicated I had arrived at the correct destination by the scenic route. "Rotherby has been a guest here for 5 years. A man with a military intelligence about rooms and routes does not spend 5 years in a house without learning its geography." We went inside. The chapel passage was exactly what Holmes had described. A narrow corridor of stone, dimly lit by 2 small windows set high in the outer wall, its floor flagged in the same dark stone as the courtyard threshold. It smelled of cold and long disuse, and the dust along its edges was largely undisturbed. Largely, but not entirely. Holmes moved along the left wall, his gaze fixed on the floor, and I followed behind him with the consciousness of a man who is trying very hard not to disturb what he has not yet been told is significant. At the far end, where the passage met the east corridor through a low door set almost invisibly into the panelling, Holmes paused again. The dust near the door had been disturbed in a narrow track, as though swept rather than walked through, but not swept with any instrument. It had the look of the hem of a coat or dressing gown moving close to the floor. "He came in from the courtyard," Holmes said quietly, "through here, and reached the east corridor without passing any of the main rooms or being visible from the staircase. To an observer on the first floor, he would have been completely invisible." We stood in the chapel passage for a moment in the chill and the silence, and I thought about what that route meant in practical terms. A man who knew this passage could move from the drawing-room wing to Sir Geoffrey's bedchamber and back without appearing in any of the spaces where the rest of the household might observe him. He would need only an unobserved moment to step into the courtyard, a visit to the cloakroom, an errand to fetch something left in an outer room, and the rest of the route was private. We went back through the courtyard and into the main house, and Holmes spent the remainder of the afternoon not in further interviews but in conversation with the household servants, which he conducted not in the library but in the kitchen passage and the butler's pantry, in the informal way that tends to produce more honest answers than formal settings. I was not present for all of these conversations, but I gathered their substance from what Holmes told me afterward, and from the shift in his expression that I recognised as the satisfaction of a man whose pattern is filling in. The servants had, it emerged, been protecting their employers in the small ways that loyal domestic staff will, without quite understanding what they are doing. The head housemaid had not mentioned that she had heard Lady Evelyn moving on the upper landing at an unusual hour because she had assumed her mistress was distressed and had wished to give her privacy. The butler had not recorded in his nightly account that he had discovered a decanter out of place in the morning-room, because he had thought it an oversight of his own. A junior footman had seen Edward Harcourt at the door of the study at approximately 11:30, and had kept quiet about it because Harcourt had told him with some urgency that he was retrieving something that had been left there and that there was no need to mention it. None of these silences, Holmes said, were conspiratorial. They were the ordinary workings of a household in which people protected one another from embarrassment as a matter of habit, and they had created, collectively, a set of false shadows around movements that were in themselves innocent. Lady Evelyn had walked the landing because she had heard a sound and had chosen not to investigate it, reasoning that her husband was a private man and did not welcome intrusion. Edward Harcourt had been in the study for the reason he gave the footman. He had left a letter there that he wished to retrieve before Sir Geoffrey could read it in the morning, as it contained a request for money he now regretted. Clara had gone to the corridor and turned back as she had said. These were all accountable. None of them were what had happened in Sir Geoffrey's room. In the early evening, Holmes found the original blotting paper. It had been placed at the bottom of the wastepaper basket in the study, beneath a layer of subsequent papers, in the way that things are sometimes concealed not by removal, but by coverage. He examined it by lamplight, turning it so that the reversed impressions became legible, and I read over his shoulder. The impression was clear. The certificate, when first blotted, had recorded the time as 11:50. The figures were reversed but unmistakable. 11:50 was the original entry. 12:20 was the amendment. So Fell did not correct his own error, I said. Fell wrote 11:50 and signed the document. Someone else altered it to 12:20 afterward. Holmes set the blotting paper down with the care of a man handling something that has settled a question he has been carrying for 3 days. The question that remains is what advantage 12:20 was supposed to provide, and to whom. He didn't answer his own question. He set the blotting paper aside for Inspector Crail and went to dress for dinner. I stood in the study a moment longer, looking at the reverse numerals on the blotting paper, and I thought about a man moving silently through a forgotten passage in the dark, and about the particular coldness of a person who has calculated very carefully what shadow someone else should stand in. Chapter 7. The False Confession. The third morning at Blackthorn Hall arrived with a change in the weather that was more psychological than meteorological. The snow had not melted, the moors were still white to every horizon, and the temperature had not risen appreciably. But the storm had withdrawn, the sky had cleared to a pale, cold blue, and the quality of light through the windows was sharper and more honest than the grey diffusion of the preceding days. There is something in clear winter light that makes concealment harder, not because it illuminates more, but because it removes the comfortable ambiguity that grey weather provides. People who have been managing their expressions for 3 days under cloud will sometimes find them more difficult to maintain under such a sky. I was at breakfast when the discovery was made. Holmes had not yet come down, which was not unusual. He was sometimes absent from the early hours entirely, having spent them in thought, or in some private investigation he had not yet seen fit to describe to me. It was the butler, Alderman, who brought the news to Inspector Crail, and Crail who came to find me with an expression that combined official satisfaction with something that looked, on more careful examination, like relief. "A piece of paper has been found in Mr. Harcourt's room," he said. "You'll want to see it, I think. And Mr. Holmes." We found Holmes on the landing, already dressed, as though he had heard something, though I could not imagine what, and had anticipated the summons. He said nothing as Crail led us to Harcourt's room, a square, rather bare chamber on the first floor, whose furnishings suggested a guest who had not expected to remain so long, and had not made himself entirely comfortable with the accommodation. The paper lay on the writing desk. It had been found by the housemaid between the blotter and the desk's leather surface, as though slipped there and forgotten, or perhaps concealed with insufficient thoroughness. It was a single sheet, torn across the top as though separated from a longer document or a letter that had been begun and abandoned. The handwriting was Harcourt's, or sufficiently resembled what I had seen of it to make the attribution plausible. I read it over Crail's shoulder. The note was unfinished, breaking off mid-sentence, and what it contained was a confession of a kind, not of murder precisely, but of panic. It spoke of having acted in a moment of confusion and fear, of not having meant for things to proceed as they had, of having handled a document in a way that could not now be undone. It referred, obliquely but unmistakably, to the death certificate. It did not specify what had been done or why, but its general import was that Harcourt had been responsible for the alteration and was conscious of having committed a serious wrong. Crail looked satisfied. Harcourt, who had been brought from his room and stood near the window in his dressing gown, looked wretched. And then, after a silence that stretched to perhaps half a minute, he broke. He had not, he said, meant to deceive anyone permanently. He had panicked on the night of his uncle's death. He had found the certificate on the study table after Dr. Fell had completed it, and had, in a moment of impulse that he could not now adequately explain, altered the time. He had not been thinking clearly. He was sorry. He was deeply, profoundly sorry. Inspector Crail listened to this with the expression of a man watching a complicated knot resolve itself into a simple loop. I watched Holmes. Holmes was not watching Harcourt. He was looking at the piece of paper in Crail's hand with an attention that had nothing to do with its contents and everything to do with its physical properties. He asked pleasantly whether he might examine it. Crail handed it over. Holmes took the paper to the window, where the clear morning light was strongest, and held it in that precise way of his, flat first, then angled, then close with the lens, that managed to look casual whilst missing nothing. He studied the ink. He studied the pressure of the pen strokes. He looked at the tear across the top, and at the fold marks, and at the corner where a slight moisture had caused the paper to cockle very slightly. He handed it back to Crail without comment. Harcourt was still talking, filling the silence with the uneven fluency of a man whose confession is partly genuine and partly something he has convinced himself into, the two elements becoming indistinguishable even to him. He had not intended harm. He had been desperate. The inheritance question had weighed on him more than he had admitted. He did not attempt to justify himself, only to explain, which under the circumstances was the more believable posture. Crail was preparing to take a formal statement. I drew Holmes aside and asked him, under my breath, what he thought. He spoke quietly and without taking his eyes from the room. "The ink is wrong," he said. "Harcourt's correspondence, which Lady Evelyn provided to me yesterday at my request, uses a blue-black fluid of the kind common in the better writing sets. The ink on that paper is a pure black of a different viscosity. You can see it in the way it sits on the surface rather than sinking into the grain. It was written recently, within the last 24 hours. A confession written the night of the death would have had 3 days to oxidize. This has not. Then it was written by someone else. Written by someone who has access to this room, who can approximate Harcourt's hand sufficiently to convince a cursory reading, and who has done so in the last day, having had time to observe the investigation developing and to decide that it needed a more definitive conclusion. He was still watching the room where Crail was now writing. There is a second difficulty. Harcourt's supposed confession states that he found the certificate on the study table after Fell had completed it, but Fell has said, consistently and in detail, that he completed the certificate in Sir Geoffrey's bedchamber and took it downstairs himself. Harcourt could not have encountered it on the study table unless someone moved it, and that someone would have had to tell Harcourt about it. Which means the confession contains knowledge that could only have come from the person who arranged the certificate's subsequent journey. Knowledge Harcourt could not possess on his own, I said, and which his confessor did not realise he was gifting to us. I looked at Harcourt, who was signing something Crail had placed before him, with the depleted compliance of a man who has talked himself into a position he does not fully understand. I looked at the note. I looked at the assembled household, which had gathered in various degrees of proximity to the doorway, as households will when something official is occurring. Captain Rotherby stood at the back, slightly apart from the others, with his arms folded and his expression one of grave, concerned attention. As Harcourt signed, I saw Rotherby's shoulders drop by perhaps half an inch. A minute adjustment, the kind that occurs in a body when a tension it has been holding is released. I noted it. I said nothing. Holmes allowed the proceedings to continue to their natural resting point. He did not challenge Harcourt's account in Crail's presence. He did not produce the contradictions he had identified. He returned to his place near the window and maintained the expression of a man who was thinking about something else entirely, which was, I had learned, the expression he wore when he was thinking about something most intensely. Afterward, in the corridor, he said, "Crail is a capable man, and will do what capable men do when the evidence appears complete. We will let him believe it is complete for the present. You are using Harcourt as a screen. I am allowing a screen that has been placed in front of me to remain in position long enough to see who arranged it." He set off toward the staircase. "There is one more thing I need to confirm, and I shall need access to a part of the house that has not yet been examined. The old chapel itself, not merely its passage. What do you expect to find there?" He paused at the top of the stair, and for a moment he looked not like a man in pursuit of a solution, but like a man who had already arrived there and was patiently waiting for the evidence to catch him up. "Not find," he said. "Confirm. There is a considerable difference, Watson, between looking for a thing and verifying that it is where you already know it to be." He descended, and I followed, and behind us the house settled back into its watch, the clear winter light moving steadily across the floors, finding nothing it had not already seen. Chapter 8. The Helpful Gentleman. Inspector Crail spent the morning in the comfortable certainty of a man whose case has resolved itself. He sat with Harcourt's signed statement at the library table and constructed around it the tidy architecture of an official conclusion. The inheritance motive, the altered certificate, the found confession, the guilty nephew. He was not an unintelligent man, and he would not have been satisfied by evidence that contradicted itself outright. But the evidence as presented did not contradict itself outright. It merely contained subtleties that required a particular quality of attention to perceive, and Crail's attention, understandably enough, had gone elsewhere. Captain Rotherby proved invaluable to him throughout the morning. He appeared in the library at intervals with remembered details. A sound he'd heard in the corridor, a remark Edward Harcourt had made at dinner 2 evenings ago about the burdens of financial uncertainty, a slight agitation he had observed in Harcourt's manner on the day of our arrival. Each contribution was offered with becoming diffidence, as though Rotherby were reluctant to add to a young man's difficulties, but felt compelled by duty to be complete. Crail received each offering with quiet gratitude and incorporated it into his notes. I observed this from the doorway on 2 separate occasions and reported what I had seen to Holmes, who received it without surprise and with the brief nod of a man checking a column of figures he's already summed in his head. Holmes had spent the morning in the old chapel. He had found it, as he told me afterward, through a door at the far end of the chapel passage that was not locked, but had not been opened for some time, its lower edge dragging on the stone where the flags had shifted slightly over the decades. Inside, the chapel was small, bare, and very cold, its pews pushed to the walls in the manner of a room cleared for storage rather than worship. The east window was of plain glass, its coloured panels long since removed or broken, and the light through it was neutral and even. Nothing about the room itself was remarkable. What was remarkable was what Holmes found near the door that connected the chapel to the covered courtyard on its far side. He brought me there after luncheon, when Crail was occupied with his paperwork and the household had dispersed into the particular aimless quiet of people who feel the worst may be over but are not yet certain of it. The courtyard door of the chapel was of heavy oak, and it swung inward. Beside it, on the stone floor, Holmes crouched and indicated a mark that I would not have noticed had he not directed my attention to it precisely. It was a small crescent of moisture, dried now to a faint tide mark on the dark stone, perhaps 2 inches across. The kind of mark that melted snow makes when it drips from a boot heel onto an indoor floor. He paused here, Holmes said. Long enough for the snow to melt from his boot and collect. Not long enough for it to spread. He was not standing still. He was moving, but slowly, and he stopped briefly at this point, perhaps to listen before continuing into the passage. I looked at the mark, then at the door, then at the passage mouth beyond. The route was clear in my mind now as a physical fact rather than a reconstruction. The drawing-room wing, where Rotherby had claimed to spend his evening, connected to a cloakroom off the main hall, which gave onto the covered courtyard, and the courtyard gave onto this door, and this door onto the chapel, and the chapel passage onto the east corridor and Sir Geoffrey's room. A man could make the journey in under 4 minutes if he moved steadily and knew the way. He brought the clock through here, Holmes said, standing. That is what the displaced rug told us. Something carried to the bed rather than drawn from it. The bracket clock from one of the spare rooms in the old wing moved through this passage and placed on Sir Geoffrey's mantel after death to establish a false time. And the candle brought from the chapel itself, where a pair of altar candlesticks remain, as you can see. I looked where he indicated. Against the far wall of the chapel, pushed to the side with the displaced pews, stood a pair of brass candlesticks. One held its candle intact, the other was bare, the socket stained with old wax, and beneath the old wax a more recent residue of a slightly different colour. He took the candle from the chapel, I said, and placed it beside the bed to suggest Sir Geoffrey had been reading or sitting up past midnight. The candle burned for as long as it burned, and he returned at some point to observe how far it had progressed, and how the scene appeared. He is a meticulous man. He was a careful officer, I should think, in his time. We walked back through the chapel passage in silence, and I thought about the mantel clock in Sir Geoffrey's room. Holmes had said in Chapter 3 that it had been moved from another room, the dust mark beneath it proving its recent arrival. He had also determined that its spring retained tension, and that its hands had been manually arrested. All of this now connected to the route through the chapel, with the simple coherence of a mechanism in which every part performs its function. The clock, I said. Where did it come from originally? The small sitting room at the end of the old wing. I confirmed it this morning. There is a rectangle on the mantelpiece there, cleaner than the surrounding surface, where the clock stood until recently. No one uses that room in winter. We emerged from the passage into the main house, and Holmes paused in the east corridor to examine the panelled door through which the passage opened. It was, as he had said, nearly invisible, flush with the panelling, without a visible handle on the corridor side, operated by pressing a specific point in the moulding that released a simple catch. It would have been completely invisible to anyone unfamiliar with its existence. 5 years of visits, I said. Sufficient time to learn a house very thoroughly, particularly for a man whose military training inclined him to note exits, routes, and the geography of any space he occupied. I should estimate that Rotherby knew this passage before the current difficulty arose, and had perhaps thought about its utility in other contexts before the necessity of this one presented itself. That afternoon I watched Rotherby in the drawing-room, where the household had reassembled in the tentative way of people who are not sure whether the crisis is concluded and are waiting for confirmation. He was at his case entirely. He spoke to Lady Evelyn with quiet sympathy, offered Clara Bellamy a few gentle words about the resolution of the matter, and assured Reverend Pritchard that Harcourt would no doubt find appropriate counsel. He managed the room with the invisible competence of a man who has managed difficult situations before and found them navigable. It was the risk that confirmed everything, in the end, and in the way that the most important confirmations often come, not dramatically, but in the middle of an ordinary sentence about nothing of consequence. Rotherby reached across the occasional table to return a book he'd picked up, and his coat sleeve drew back half an inch with the movement. The cuff beneath was a very pale grey, but at the inner side of the wrist, where the courtyard door would have been touched in passing, where a gloved hand pushing through a door onto a snow-edged frame might have collected moisture and transferred it to the underside of the cuff, there was a damp stain, imperfectly dried, slightly darker than the surrounding fabric. He had claimed, in his account to Crail that morning, never to have left the drawing-room wing on the night of Sir Geoffrey's death. I looked away before he could notice that I had seen it. Holmes was not in the room. He did not need to be. The wrist told me what the chapel and the clock and the candle had already told him, in the language of objects that do not revise their testimony to suit the occasion. That evening Holmes asked Lady Evelyn whether she would consent to gather the household in the drawing-room the following morning. He said it with the quiet assurance of a man extending a courtesy rather than making a request. She agreed without asking why. She was, I thought, a woman who had already arrived by her own route at the general direction of the answer. "Tomorrow," Holmes said to me as we retired, "we shall give the objects the opportunity to speak in public." He said good night and closed his door, and I stood in the cold corridor and thought about a man who had spent 5 years assembling a patience and a knowledge and a route, and who had made, in the end, a single error, too visible to be explained by anything except the truth. Chapter 9. Holmes reconstructs the night. The drawing-room at Blackthorn Hall was at its best in the morning, when the light came through the south-facing windows at an angle that warmed the old Turkey carpet, and gave the room a quality of comfortable solidity that its present occupants were not, I thought, in a position to appreciate. They assembled at Holmes's request with varying degrees of composure. Lady Evelyn sat in her customary chair near the fire, upright and attentive. Clara Bellamy took a place beside her, hands folded, expression contained. Reverend Pritchard settled into the corner chair that had become habitual to him over the preceding days. Mr. Trent stood near the window with his arms at his sides, as a man stands when he expects to be required to take notes and wishes to be positioned accordingly. Edward Harcourt sat apart from the group near the door, in the posture of a man who is not certain whether he is a guest at this proceeding or a subject of it, and has resolved to betray neither assumption until the distinction becomes clear. He had not yet been formally charged with anything, Crail having proceeded with the particular official caution that comes from consulting a superior and finding the superior less convinced than oneself. This, I suspected, had been something Holmes had arranged through a quiet word the previous evening, though he had not told me so directly. Dr. Fell came in last, acknowledged the room with a general nod, and chose a chair near the centre with the expression of a man who has decided to be steady regardless of what he is about to be asked to be steady about. Captain Rotherby was already present when I entered. He had arrived early and positioned himself near the mantelpiece, an instinct perhaps for commanding ground, and stood with one hand resting on the marble shelf, his manner that of a gracious host at someone else's gathering. He greeted me pleasantly, and remarked that he was glad the business was to be concluded, as the household had borne considerable strain. Holmes entered without preamble. He did not sit. He stood in the centre of the room, and there was about him that particular quality of settled authority that I had observed at the resolution of other cases, not theatrical, not aggressive, simply the bearing of a man who knows precisely what he's about to say, and has considered every word of it. Inspector Crail took a chair beside the door with his notebook open. Holmes acknowledged him with a brief nod and began. "Sir Geoffrey Harcourt did not die at 20 minutes past midnight," he said. He died before midnight between 11 o'clock and 11:50, which is the time that Dr. Fell correctly recorded on the death certificate at the bedside. The alteration of that certificate to 12:20 was not a clerical correction, a moment of panic, or an act of confused conscience. It was a deliberate element of a carefully constructed deception, designed not to protect the person who made it, but to produce the appearance that an inheritance fraud had been attempted by others. The room was quiet. Outside, a rook called once and fell silent. The physical evidence in Sir Geoffrey's bedchamber has been set before you in parts over the preceding days, and I shall assemble it now into its proper order. The bracket clock on the mantelpiece was not the clock that ordinarily occupied that position. It was carried from the unoccupied sitting room at the end of the old wing, its hands set to 12:20, and the mechanism arrested by pressure against the escapement. The clock from Sir Geoffrey's own room, a carriage clock kept on the bedside table, as Lady Evelyn has confirmed, was removed, presumably because its last recorded position would not have supported the false timing. The replacement clock was placed to create the impression that Sir Geoffrey had lived and died 30 minutes later than he had. Trent made a small sound. Holmes did not pause. The candle beside the bed was carried through the chapel passage from the old chapel itself, where one of a pair of altar candlesticks is now missing its candle. It was lit elsewhere and carried already burning, which accounts for the wax having dripped on the wrong side for the candlestick's position in the room. A candle held in a moving hand tilts against the direction of motion, and the wax ran accordingly. The rug beside the bed was displaced by the movement of the clock being carried to the mantel and set down, the carrier having navigated the room in low light and caught the rug's edge with his foot. He turned slightly and addressed the next portion not to the room in general but to no one in particular, which was, I had observed, his method of making a statement that one person present would feel as a directed blow. The route taken was through the covered courtyard and the old chapel passage, which connects by a concealed door to the east corridor. Traces of melted snow remain on the chapel's courtyard threshold, and on the chapel floor beside the inner door, consistent with a person who crossed the courtyard in snow and entered the chapel passage without pausing to remove his boots. The passage itself retains a disturbance in the dust along the left wall, at the height of a long coat's hem. The person who walked it is tall, moves with the habitual economy of a man trained in physical discipline, and has known this house well enough and long enough to know a passage that the present household had largely forgotten. He stopped. The fire shifted in the grate. No one in the room moved. The motive, Holmes continued, does not reside in the inheritance at all. The altered certificate was designed to make it appear as though the inheritance was the motive, to cast suspicion upon Edward Harcourt, who would benefit from the earlier time, and upon Clara Bellamy, who would benefit from the later, and thereby to create a fog of competing accusations that would obscure the true reason for Sir Geoffrey's death. That reason is older and more serious than a disputed estate. Sir Geoffrey had discovered that a person of his close acquaintance had, years ago, committed a significant fraud against the military pension system, a fraud by which that person had drawn moneys to which he had no entitlement, and by which men who had genuinely served and suffered had been deprived of their due provision. Sir Geoffrey, being a man of conscience and of law, had resolved to expose this fraud. He had spoken of it to Reverend Pritchard in veiled terms. He had indicated to Mr. Trent that he was in possession of troubling information. He had, I believe, informed the person himself that he intended to act. Holmes turned his gaze directly to the mantelpiece. Captain Rotherby sold his commission under circumstances that have not been examined publicly. His pension is of a scale inconsistent with his recorded rank and service duration. He has been a guest of this house for 5 years, long enough to understand its geography, its routines, and its legal situation. Long enough to know that if Sir Geoffrey died at a time that made the death certificate a disputed document, the question of when he died would consume all attention, and leave the question of how he died largely unexamined. Rotherby had not moved. His hand remained on the mantelpiece. His face had undergone a change that was not dramatic, no collapse, no declaration, no violence, but a slow draining of its ordinary social expression, as colour drains from a room when the lamp is turned down. What remained was something quieter and harder, and I thought in that moment that I was looking at the face the man had worn in private for a very long time. "You will note," Holmes said, "the stain on the inner left cuff of the garment Captain Rotherby wore yesterday afternoon, and wears again this morning. It was observed independently by Dr. Watson. It is consistent with moisture acquired by contact with a snow-edged door frame in a covered courtyard. Captain Rotherby has stated that he did not leave the drawing-room wing on the night in question. The cuff states otherwise, and unlike Captain Rotherby, the cuff has not revised its account." The silence lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then Rotherby took his hand from the mantelpiece and straightened, with the precise, controlled movement of a man who has decided how to stand in the moment he has long understood was eventually coming. "You're very thorough, Mr. Holmes," he said. His voice was steady. It was, I thought, the most genuinely impressive thing I'd heard him say in 4 days, because it was the first thing he had said that had no purpose beyond accuracy. Crail was already on his feet. Holmes stood aside. I watched Rotherby leave the room between the inspector and his constable, still upright, still composed, the pleasantness entirely gone from his face and replaced by something that was not precisely dignity, but was the closest approximation that the circumstances permitted. Clara Bellamy exhaled slowly beside me. Edward Harcourt put his face in his hands. Lady Evelyn looked at the window, at the snow that lay across the unchanged moors, and said nothing at all. Chapter 10. The Thaw. The snow began to yield on the afternoon of the 4th day. It did not retreat dramatically. There was no sudden warmth, no decisive change in the sky, simply a softening at the edges of things. The drifts along the avenue of limes settling imperceptibly, the icicles at the eaves beginning their patient drip, the moor road becoming passable first to a man on foot, then to a light cart, and finally, by early evening, to the police conveyance that had waited at Harrowfield since the previous morning for precisely this concession from the weather. Captain Rotherby left Blackthorn Hall in it, as the last light was leaving the sky, and the sound of the wheels on the freshly exposed gravel was, in its small way, the most conclusive thing I heard during the entire case. Inspector Crail departed with him, having shaken Holmes's hand with a warmth that somewhat exceeded official protocol and expressed the hope that the matter of the pension fraud would be pursued through the appropriate military channels. Holmes assured him that he would furnish a written account of his conclusions and that the documents Sir Geoffrey had evidently been assembling, which were subsequently found in the locked drawer of the study desk, along with a letter of intent addressed to the relevant War Office Department, would speak for themselves with considerable clarity. Edward Harcourt's signed statement was set aside. Crail had been prevailed upon to treat it as a document produced under duress of conscience rather than of guilt, and Harcourt had spent the afternoon in a state of diminished misery that I thought rather becoming in him. There was a quality of genuine reckoning in his manner that had not been present when we arrived. He found me in the entrance hall as the police vehicle's lantern receded down the avenue and said, without any of his former restlessness, that he owed Holmes a debt he was not certain how to acknowledge. "Do not inherit badly," Holmes said from the doorway, which silenced Harcourt entirely and prompted him, after a moment, to go upstairs. Clara Bellamy was the person I found most difficult to account for that evening. She had said very little since the drawing-room, and had spent the afternoon in her own rooms, emerging only briefly to ask whether she might speak to Mr. Trent privately, which she did for perhaps 40 minutes in the library. When she came out, she thanked Holmes in the direct, unembellished manner I had come to associate with her, and said she intended to write to a cousin in Edinburgh in the morning. She said nothing about the estate, and Holmes asked her nothing about it, which I thought was the correct instinct on both their parts. The legal question would proceed at its own pace and in its own forum, and it would be resolved, as Trent confirmed to me later that evening, by reference to the original certificate and to Holmes's reconstruction, which together established the time of death as before midnight beyond any reasonable contest. The estate of Blackthorn Hall would not pass as Rotherby had intended the household to believe. Lady Evelyn asked us to remain for dinner, and we did. The meal was quieter than those that had preceded it, and in some respects more comfortable. There is an ease that descends on a table when people are no longer managing what they say, even if what they have stopped managing has been replaced by the more ordinary weight of consequence. Reverend Pritchard said grace with somewhat more feeling than usual. Dr. Fell ate with the recovered appetite of a man whose professional character has been restored to him, though he remained subdued, and I thought he was already composing in some interior part of his attention the account he would give of the matter to his practice and his county colleagues. After dinner, Holmes and I sat with Lady Evelyn in the smaller sitting room while the fire was made up, and she poured tea with a steadiness of hand that I found genuinely admirable. She did not speak immediately, and neither did we. The clock on the mantel, her own in its proper room, marked the quarter hour. "He was a severe man," she said at last, not as a criticism, but as an observation she had spent many years arriving at with precision. He was also, in his way, a just one. I did not always find those qualities comfortable in combination, but I think I understood in the last years that he found them difficult himself. She set her cup down. He knew what Rotherby was. I think he had known for some time and had not been certain how to act on it, without causing a damage he could not control. When he finally resolved the question, he resolved it completely, as he resolved everything. He would have succeeded, Holmes said. The documents he had assembled were thorough. Another month and the matter would have been before the appropriate authority, regardless of any interference. Then the interference came too late to prevent it entirely, she said, only too early to allow him to see it done. She said this without bitterness, or perhaps with a bitterness so old and well acquainted that it had worn its sharp edges smooth. I did not attempt a consolation. There are moments in which a doctor learns that the most honest thing he can offer is silence, and this was one of them. Later, Holmes and I walked briefly in the grounds before retiring, a thing we had not managed since our arrival, the weather having been inhospitable to all but necessary movement. The snow was still substantial underfoot, but the air had changed quality, softer, with the faint distinctive smell of water that accompanies a thaw. The lime trees stood in their avenue, very still, their branches holding small loads of snow that dropped occasionally without warning in soft, sudden releases. Holmes walked with his hands behind his back and said nothing for some time. I had accompanied him through enough conclusions to know that the silence following a case's resolution was distinct from his other silences, less directed, more personal, with something in it that I might, in another man, have called tiredness. The misdirection was accomplished, I said eventually, but not the concealment. He had not counted on the certificate being examined carefully. He had counted on it being examined in a particular way, Holmes replied. He expected the alteration to be discovered. He arranged the inheritance question precisely so that it would be. A certificate altered to benefit a dead man's ward. That is a story any inspector would recognise immediately. He wanted the certificate found, wanted the argument about the time, wanted Edward's glove and Clara's midnight walk and all the innocent evidence that would build itself into a structure of false guilt. He did not expect that someone would stand in the room and ask why the wax had dripped on the wrong side. We reached the end of the avenue and turned back toward the house. Its windows were lit against the dark, and it looked, from that distance, entirely serene. "What will become of him?" I asked. "That will depend on what the military inquiry establishes, and on what the courts determine about Sir Geoffrey's death. The pension fraud is documentable and serious. The other matter—" He paused. Sir Geoffrey was an old man who had complained of his heart, and who was found, by a local physician, to have died of its failure. I have demonstrated that the scene was staged and that Rotherby was present, but demonstrating the precise mechanism of death in a room with no witness and a body 3 days cold is a different matter. Then he may not be held fully accountable. "He will be held accountable for what the evidence will hold," Holmes said, in the tone of a man who has made his peace with the distinction he finds imperfect. That is the limit of the law, and the law is better with its limits than without them. We went inside, and the warmth of the hall met us with a completeness that made the cold outside suddenly vivid by contrast. I recorded the case in my notes that night by the light of the bedroom lamp, setting down the sequence as I had lived it, and as Holmes had illuminated it, from the altered figures on a death certificate to the wax that ran the wrong way, and the clock that had never stood in that room before. The mystery had presented itself in the language of inheritance and locked rooms and snowbound isolation, but it had been solved in the language that Holmes always preferred, the quiet, unambiguous testimony of objects that had no motive to deceive. He said as much the following morning, as we waited in the cold forecourt for Joskins to bring the coach for Harrowfield Station, our bags at our feet, and the moors white and still and beginning very slightly to remember that spring existed. "When men lie, Watson," he said, watching the avenue, "they invent events, but objects do not invent. They merely remain where guilt has left them." The coach came, we climbed in. Blackthorn Hall diminished behind us as the road descended, and by the time we reached the first turning, it was only a grey shape against a white hill, growing smaller, as things do when you are moving away from them, until the lane curved and took it from sight entirely.